Greetings and salutations to everyone. Greetings to friends of the Center for Reparation Research, members of our advisory board, the network of scholars, the National Reparation Commissions, members of the CARICOM Reparations Commission, all our partners and stakeholders who might be attending today. I want to greet everyone. I also want to do something that's really important. As a University of the West Indies, we recognize and declare that the land on which we operate as an institution of higher learning is the original or traditional territory of many peoples. The UWI acknowledges the First Nation, comprising the indigenous people who were displaced by the Columbus Project and general European colonization, and the hundreds of Africans who toiled for more than 100 years as enslaved people on the old Papine sugar estate. The UWI recognizes their labor and sacrifices in preserving this land that has enabled the establishment of a university that now provides opportunities for many of their descendants to receive an education that they themselves were denied. I therefore greet you all, also in the name of our ancestors, many who were on this plantation as well. The CARICOM Reparation Commission's 10-point plan of 2013 has offered the Caribbean a common blueprint to analyze the lasting legacies of chattel slavery in the region. We at the Center for Reparation Research see it as a development plan which details various areas of repair necessary to achieve a stable society which can surmount the challenges of the past, specifically those within the boundaries of the plantation. The Center for Reparation Research strives through its mandate of education, advocacy, and research to create a space for interdisciplinary discussion about the whys and the hows for achieving fundamental development goals. The case for political reparation, as you know, must consider the need for physical reparation in the post-colonial context when we place concerns of underdevelopment into focus. This underdevelopment, following the lack of infrastructural development and the continued oppression through extractive relationships, has resulted in the proliferation of improper diets, low healthcare benefits, among others. Scholars such as Professor Sir Hilary Beckles highlight clearly the case for economic reparation, that Britain exited on the cheap end when countries were given independence, that the federation, which was being articulated inside the nationalist movement in the Caribbean, was one without funding, and that a colonial mess has been left by Britain, which it has displayed no interest in cleaning up. Those of us following the reparation movement would have seen a firestorm of commentary in the British press from politicians whose agenda it is to reject reparation as a cash grab on the part of those who suffered under the capitalist enterprise, which was the transatlantic trade in enslaved Africans and the plantation system through which they were rendered as chattel. The recent Commonwealth meeting in Samoa gave us a good example of this kind of firestorm commentary coming out of the British press. But what is the evidence today that something is not all well? The rise of non-communicable diseases in Jamaica has meant a dramatic rise in the number of people seeking assistance from regional health centers and hospitals. Non-communicable diseases such as cardiovascular disease, diabetes, and chronic lower respiratory disease are the leading cause of death, we are told, and continue to be a major public health burden in Jamaica due to the lifelong treatment and care needed to address these chronic conditions all over the region. In Jamaica alone, 70% of all deaths seem to be due to one of the four major NCDs, we are told: cancer, lung disease, diabetes, and heart disease, while many more will continue to live with lifelong disability due to complications as a result of an NCD. These requiring persons to have regular contact with health centers. This webinar on public health and the legacies of chattel slavery is the first in our series to focus attention on the 10-point plan, public health in particular, in a systematic way. Today, we are happy to host a panel of scholars who have each analyzed something of the health impact of chattel slavery on Caribbean people from different disciplinary perspectives. As we highlight their research, I encourage you to participate and tell us about your own experience with these legacies as we help each other to increase knowledge, understanding, and ultimately repair our healthcare system undergirded by implications of trauma, both mental and physiological, that impact the way we contend with the legacies of chattel slavery today. I am Sonia Stanley Nayo, Director of the Center for Reparation Research, and your moderator today. We are pleased to see so many participants in this webinar and hope that you will take the conversation further to your dining tables, your offices, your bedrooms, and ultimately your communities. Wellness is indeed a significant goal for my tenure in the Center for Reparation Research, and I'm looking forward to the teaching, the learning, and the discussion today. Before I introduce our distinguished panelists, I'd like to introduce item 5 of the CARICOM Reparation 10-point plan. And this relates to assistance in remedying the public health crisis. CARICOM member states are committed to providing high standards of healthcare for their populations in accordance with their international obligations. They are, however, unable on their own to deal with the multiple diseases that are the legacy of enslavement and have the potential to affect the majority of their populations. For example, the African descendant population in the Caribbean has the highest incidence in the world of chronic diseases I mentioned, particularly hypertension and type 2 diabetes. And this is outlined as an explanation in relation to this CARICOM 10-point plan number 5. New medical evidence has shown that this is a result of the nutritional experience, the physical and emotional brutality, and overall stress profiles associated with 400 years of enslavement. And we need to talk more about this. The centuries of poor nutrition and overly salted foods given to the enslaved have now transmitted an intergenerational tendency for hypertension. This has devastating consequences, but I know that in your own time, you're going to educate yourselves for those who may not be aware of the CARICOM 10-point plan, number 5 in particular, and what has guided our own initiation of this dialogue in relation to public health. I'm going to now introduce you to Professor William Aiken, our first speaker. He's head of urology at the University Hospital of the West Indies and a lecturer there. He currently serves on the Medical Council of Jamaica and is an international surgical advisor for Jamaica by the Royal College of Surgeons of Edinburgh. I also want to introduce Dr. Natalie Graves, who is a lecturer in public health and coordinator of the MPhil PhD program in public health and epidemiology in the Faculty of Medical Sciences, UWI Cave Hill. Her teaching, research, and advocacy focuses on applied public health in the areas of cancer prevention, palliative care, and the intersection between climate and health. Much needed work. Natalie holds several leadership roles, including being regional principal investigator for the African Caribbean Cancer Consortium, network of over 200 scientists. Dr. Nicole Plummer is a lecturer in cultural studies in the Institute of Caribbean Studies, Faculty of Humanities and Education at the UWI Mona campus. Her current research areas and publications connect Jamaican history and popular culture, food heritage and culture, as well as climate justice and wellness, along with Jamaican folk culture and mythology. So you can see we have an array of research interests, research areas and disciplines as we try to chart this conversation about public health and the legacies of chattel slavery. So let me go to Professor Aiken to start us off with his presentation.
Are you hearing me? Thank you for inviting me to participate in this very important webinar looking at the public health effects of chattel slavery. My particular contribution is looking at some contemporary attributes of Afro-Caribbean peoples as it relates to the transatlantic trade in enslaved peoples. Okay, my slide is not forwarding. Okay, so in 2011, we put forward a medical hypothesis, and this was published in the Journal of Medical Hypothesis. And again, we looked at contemporary attributes of Afro-Caribbean peoples and correlated this with the severe population bottleneck experienced by enslaved peoples in the transatlantic trade in Africans. Specifically, we looked at historical records which document extremely high mortality rates amongst people. It's documented that anywhere from 10 to 96% of the enslaved persons were died as a result of the transatlantic trade. At the time, there were two philosophies of packing enslaved peoples. There was tight packing, and in this philosophy, they wanted to maximize on the transportation of the slaves. So they tightly packed the slaves, recognizing that a particular percentage of the enslaved persons would die as a result of the passage. And then there was loose packing, in which was a sort of more humanitarian method of packing the slaves, but notwithstanding the loose packing, this mortality rates were still quite high. Persons were transported, crammed, very tightly packed, shoulder to shoulder, in the hull of the slave ships. Of course, men and women were separated. Men were chains were hot, they were humid, they were stifling. The stench from admixed bodily fluids, the diarrhea, the vomiting, the urine, menstrual flow, all of this would have provided a very overpowering stench. And this is well described in accounts of persons who survived that passage. The ambient oxygen tension would have been very low, while carbon dioxide levels would have been high. Any cuts or bruises admixed bodily fluid would have resulted in maceration of the skin, and this was likely to result in serious infections, which would likely prove fatal. Any enslaved Africans who were very sick were thrown overboard, and those with fractures or other debilitating conditions would also have been thrown overboard. The severe physiological challenges created by the conditions under which enslaved persons were transported created a bottleneck in which, as we saw, only a particular percentage of the enslaved, those who survived the transatlantic trade had physical attributes which facilitated the survival, and those who survived differed systematically on average from those who succumbed to the conditions of the slave ship. We know that with the ambient conditions in the hull of the slave ship being very hot, that a high skin to surface area to body volume ratio would have facilitated heat exchange. We also know that those enslaved persons who had a high relative oxygen carrying capacity with a high relative hemoglobin would have been able to deliver oxygen to the tissues more efficiently. We know that those enslaved people who had a thick skin and subcutaneous tissue would have been more likely to leading to infections. And it is hypothesized that the high sebum production, which made the skin oily, would have resisted maceration. Strong bones would have resisted fractures from enslaved persons being beaten and injuries during the transatlantic journey. When we look at these attributes, all of them are related to testosterone. We know that testosterone favors lean muscle mass, as well as a high hemoglobin or oxygen carrying concentration. We know that testosterone favors a thick dermis, resisting maceration and breaches of the skin. And we also know that testosterone favors high sebum production. It also favors high bone mineralization, leading to stronger bones, which would have resisted fractures. Testosterone is an anabolic steroid, and we know that this enhances sprinting performance. It promotes growth of lean muscle mass, increases muscle strength, increases hemoglobin concentration, promotes thickening of the skin and sebum production, and it increases bone mineralization along with other effects. So the testosterone-related attributes would have facilitated survival of the severe population bottleneck brought about by the transatlantic trade in Africans. So we hypothesize that the enslaved people surviving the transatlantic trade were more likely to possess these testosterone-related attributes, and that over the course of the 4 centuries of the transatlantic trade, there would have been a population shift or genetic shift in testosterone-related phenomenon between Africans in Africa and those Africans surviving the transatlantic trade and now populating the New World. The subsequent inbreeding of enslaved Africans in the New World would have consolidated this genetic drift or population shift, resulting in a possible founder effect in which the genetics of the population of slaves in the New World or enslaved peoples would be systematically different from those of Africans in West Africa. Of course, this would be further complicated by the genetic admixture with Europeans. So what are these contemporary manifestations of testosterone-related phenomena? We know that prostate cancer is a testosterone-dependent cancer. And we know that in the Caribbean, prostate cancer accounts for not only the highest incidence of cancer, but the highest cancer-related mortality. This testosterone dependence of prostate cancer may be a byproduct of the transatlantic trade in Africans as a result of the testosterone responsiveness of those enslaved persons surviving the transatlantic trade. Testosterone promotes lean muscle mass and enhances sprinting performance. And we know that there's great sprinting prowess amongst Afro-Caribbean peoples. There's much higher sprinting prowess among Afro-Caribbean peoples compared to West Africans, if you look at the per capita production of sprinters. And if you look at Trinidad and Tobago, which is a natural experiment with a population, 40% of the population being Afro-Trinidadians and another 40% being Indo-Trinidadians, we know that there is a 3-to-1 higher risk of prostate cancer in terms of incidence and mortality amongst Afro-Trinidadians compared to Indo-Trinidadians. Now, these persons occupy the same space, they more or less have the same environmental exposures, but the incidence and mortality of from prostate cancer is 3 times higher among Afro-Trinidadians compared to Indo-Trinidadians. When we look at the sprinting prowess coming out of Trinidad, this is almost exclusively contributed to by Afro-Trinidadians. Mineral density found in Afro-Caribbean men in a study done in Tobago, looking at the bone mineral density of Afro-Caribbean men. The levels of bone mineral density were found to be extremely high compared to white men. And we know that this is a consequence of testosterone. When we look at men treated for prostate cancer with hormone therapy, which decreases the testosterone levels and decreases the bone mineral density, Afro-Caribbean men have a very low risk of adverse skeletal events like fractures, and this is because they have a higher baseline bone mineral density compared to white men. The responsiveness of the androgen receptor is thought to be due to this CAG repeat sequence in a particular part of the gene making of the androgen receptor. And this sequence is shorter in black men compared to white men, a more shorter CAG repeat sequence compared to white men. So the question is, could there be a gradient of testosterone responsiveness in the androgen receptor? We're using white men as controls. We see a gradient between West Africans and Afro-Caribbean men. And could this gradient explain some of the phenomena that we see in the Caribbean and in the New World, such as high prostate cancer mortality and effects such as great sprinting prowess? I believe that's the end of my presentation. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you so much, Professor Aiken. Under normal circumstances, those in this webinar today, many of us would say medical terms, discussing anything in terms of, just high science might be inaccessible, but your presentation was certainly accessible. And I'm going to shoot with one question for you. Would the response to oppression on the plantation in the form of resistance, in this case, clearly on the part of men, be consequential in the continued testosterone response, which you are suggesting has been impacted by the transatlantic trade in Africans?
That's a very interesting question, Dr. Stanley, now, because one of the attributes of testosterone is aggression. It increases the level of assertiveness and aggressiveness. And we know that in certain plantations in the Caribbean and the New World, there were slave uprisings, and testosterone responsiveness created more aggressiveness in these slaves. We also know that the longer the distance traveled, the greater the mortality. So could it be that the greater number of slave uprisings, the greater the distance traveled and the greater the mortality led to greater population bottleneck? And so we see the slaves, for example, the enslaved persons, for example, surviving in Jamaica being perhaps more aggressive than those in Barbados. This is very contentious, but it's food for thought.
But it's fascinating. It's fascinating to me, and certainly something I'm sure that you might want to consider, that the prolonged response continuing in terms of plantation times, there would be some consideration there for why this testosterone response is seen. Okay, thank you so much. Let's ask Dr. Graves now to proceed with her presentation.
Thank you so very much for inviting me to be here And thank you, colleagues, and thank you, Dr. Aiken, Professor Aiken, for setting up what was an excellent beginning. Now, I just want to start by sharing some fundamental principles, and I'm hoping that by the end of this presentation, that we will be able to reimagine what some people might see as being some standard definitions of public health, and that we'll be able to frame some of the challenges that we are facing in the region, and also that we would be able to, within 10 minutes or so, map a way forward. I'm hoping that within each of you, you'll be able to think through your own personal contributions to this story and this narrative. So my slides are not as technical; they're really meant to be triggering of thoughts, etc. So I'm going to slide share mode now from the very beginning, and we're just going to go through it together. And I think this is a common for those of you who are in the region, watching this from within the region. We are familiar with cane fields, and sometimes running through the cane fields at night or on your way home from school, depending on where you live, and being associated somewhat with cane fields, being associated with a little bit of pleasure now, but certainly has been articulated. They were not places of pleasure, but we live on the legacy of those who have gone before us, and it's our responsibility really to think about what we need to do in terms of transforming our health system so that it actually functions regardless of the situations that we have been put in before as a people. So by the end of this particular section, the next 10 minutes, I want us to start to redefine the term public health. There's a standard definition that's been in the literature probably for the last 30 years or so. And I think there are some challenges with that definition, and maybe we want to think about that, especially as we think about section 5 of the platform, the 10-point platform. And maybe we want to start to think about not just the transitions that we've gone through as a people, but some strategic forecasting in terms of where we need to go in terms of public health provision. And then I would like for each of us, because I think sometimes we are in positions of privilege, and we're also particularly in places where we can advocate, and we may have more than a voice and more power than we actually think that we do. And then I'm going to share some references. So the classic definition that most people would use when they're framing public health is that it's an art and it's a science, and it depends on how you want to interpret that. But I think sometimes this particular definition leads us to think very critically about how we operationalize public health, and not necessarily to keep it in the domain of medicine, etc., but to think about the power of the humanities and art-based discussions in shifting thought and shifting focus for even delivery of healthcare. So at its root, public health is always going to be seeking to prevent disease, to prolong life, and to promote health and well-being. But it has to be done through the organized efforts of society. So whatever we do here, or whatever you do in your particular centers or wherever you are across UE, we want to be thinking about how we can shift the health landscape for the population as a whole through our organized efforts. So the way how public health differs from clinical-based medicine is that, you know, as physicians, we might have our stethoscopes, or we may have our blood pressure machine monitors, etc., and we are using those particular things as being the diagnostic tool to tell us what's happening with the individual. But public health is going to be concerned with the health of the population as a whole, including those persons in your population that are marginalized. And therefore, in order for public health to work, we have to have systems that allow us to be able to monitor what is happening with our populations. And I want to really stress that. So we need to be able to see the trends, the health disease trends, etc., and to be able to figure out how our populations are changing in terms of their structure. So one of the things that you may want to be thinking through in your mind is, in this reparations discussion, and in terms of framing the history of what has happened to our people, do we have the systems in place that will help us to continue to monitor what's happening, to monitor the health disease states, to monitor the triggers, and also what's happening to the shape and the structure of our population, and what do we need to do in order, in terms of our discussions with persons that we may want to hold accountable, what do we need to do in terms of how our population is changing. So there's a wonderful body of work that already exists in the region, particularly by Sir George Allen. And if you're not familiar with some of his work, for some reason it's not advancing, I just want to summarize a framework that he articulates very nicely, and I've just really crunched it down because I think it shows us many of the points of intervention as we engage in terms of reparations and justice. So technically speaking, humanity, we always face challenges with health and maintaining the health of a group. Now, what has happened in our region, we have had a change from a situation where we would have had high birth rates, in addition to high mortality rates related to things in terms of food insecurity, a lack of sanitation, etc. And arguably, in the introduction, we heard about the challenges of the evolving and emerging health systems that would have been present in the 1950s and 60s. And there have been some global discussions that have influenced us, but we've not necessarily influenced the global discussions. So in 1978, we would have had the Alma Ata Declaration, and many of our countries would have adopted a system that worked in terms of establishing our health systems on primary health care with a focus on maternal and child health. And then we would have had a transition to Millennium Development Goals. And now we are in the phase of having the SDGs, but what's going to happen after the SDGs and how are we inputting into that conversation? So what would have happened in what we would call stage 2, we would have had situations where, because of the decrease in mortality, because of better sanitation and vaccinations and so forth, we would have had a situation where we have population growth, but now we're almost across the region, maybe perhaps with the exception of Haiti, we are seeing a slowing in our population. We are having increased longevity. We have elements of empowerment, which are very important to move our societies forward. But are we building health systems that are responsive and resilient to this lowering or this lowering of population growth alongside the longevity challenges and the NCD burden that comes along with that? So we have this construct of being bought, of being sold, of being owned, but we now need to transform that in terms of shifting the narrative, the education, the research around the things that are leading us to zero population growth, to understand what is really fundamentally affecting our nutritional patterns, etc. So this leads us to almost mapping out a landscape or a research agenda that has to be multidisciplinary in order to truly execute what would be item 5 of that program. And personally, I tend to be concerned about siloed discussions, and I'm almost waiting and hoping that maybe even this center becomes a place where we can pull together the multidisciplinary research that is necessary to generate the agenda forward to deal with all of the health challenges that we are going to face in stages 3 and 5, and most of our countries are in stage 4 of the epi transition. Okay, I hope I'm coming through clearly. So this is where I'm hoping we will have a discussion on in the future. How are we going to remedy the public health crisis? Dr. Aiken would have established some of the biological situations that have created this almost like some people will call it a tsunami of NCDs. But the fact of the matter is we also have extremely fragile health systems that are facing the dual challenge related to NCDs and then re-emerging and infectious diseases, re-emerging infectious diseases, and there's need to come together. So what I want to share is some work. So I'm very fortunate, very fortunate to be part of a team of researchers where we are looking at the impact of climate and health on our health systems, including mental health, where we have examined things related to the food and nutrition landscape to inform policy as it relates to childhood obesity and the elements of contemporary globalization that are impacting on our children. So what we have found in some of that research, and I have the references at the end, is that we really fundamentally need to understand the roots of the problems that we are having. So we're having a shift in our thinking in Caribbean in terms of how we experience space and time and how our cognitive domain is working. So you will have children who have never tasted a strawberry, who have never been to Chuck E. Cheese's, and somehow it's their favorite food. We are well aware of the childhood obesity problem, where more than 33% of Caribbean children are facing the challenges associated with obesity, and then having the perfect setup for NCDs in adulthood. But what we do not fully understand is how this effect of slavery, enslavement, contemporary globalization, how that's affecting some of the microenvironments in which disease is caused within the human body. So for example, we know that the ability to have high cortisol levels and to have the energy related to cortisol sometimes may be beneficial, but has that created a microenvironment where we have a cascade of a person being able to undergo significant amounts of stress, but having high cortisol levels and then having high ghrelin hormone, and then that leading to destabilization of the microenvironment and creating a situation where there is creation of, for lack of a better word, breakdown in the natural systems that prevent things like cancers. So for example, a simple cascade, maybe you may have a person, and we know in the Caribbean region, we have higher levels of some germline mutations. So a germline mutation is a change in your DNA structure that has been passed on from generation to generation. And we've lost a lot of our history in terms of families not necessarily knowing what has happened, or the diseases that run in their family. So we know for sure, like BRCA1, BRCA2 mutations that are responsible for breast cancer, prostate cancer, with associations with ovarian and pancreatic, they're higher in our region. And we do not fully understand what having those mutations and then being exposed to allostatic load, the stress of being in a resource limited setting, the sleep deprivation, the higher levels of cortisol, along with other variables as simple as higher temperatures, etc., what that's actually doing to our microenvironment. So I think in terms of our public health response, we have to understand what's happening to us biologically. We also need to understand a little bit more about how the environment is interacting with our genes, especially in the environment of small island developing states where we have food insecurity, where we're accessing almost on a without much inhibition or warning things that are carcinogenic, whether it be tobacco, alcohol, processed red meats, etc., that become the mainstay in our diet. And then there are some things that we would have used to survive as part of the survival mechanism in transitioning from slavery and then being in the post-colonial era, some ways in which how we naturally create and make food that also create toxicity within our bodies. And so for example, in Jamaica, it's very common to charcoal grill red meat. And that, so that's your jerk, whatever on your charcoal grill. And that automatically creates nitrosoamines that can then damage the lining of the colon and lead to colorectal cancer. I know certainly when I was growing up, and my mother was teaching me as a 10-year-old how to create the Sunday lunch, and I was learning how to brown down meat. That's what we call it here. You know, you start off with your sugar base, you put in your oil, you put in your onions and so forth, and that's the perfect mixture for creating a nitrite. So the challenge, the thing is, how do we then put in, and the nitrite then goes on to increase your risk of colorectal cancer. So how do we then educate our persons, our people, about some of the things that need to change as well? So I think we need to understand how to break free, and understanding how to break free and really influence public health. I think as Caribbean people, maybe we need to start redefining what public health is for us. I think that we need to think beyond the stage 3 to 5 of the epi transition. And I think that we have a significant body of work that says the stew that we are existing in is toxic to our tumor microenvironment and many other biological environments. And we need to think about the cascading and compounding relationships. And then finally, I just wanted to stimulate our minds in terms of, again, how are we addressing target goal number 5? How are we approaching global health in the public health in the global health space? Are we seriously thinking about how we can leverage our shared challenges, shared solutions approach with our colleagues in Africa? Are we seriously thinking and reimagining and taking hold of our health systems? Quite frankly and arguably, I think the WHO's health systems approach, the 6 building blocks, probably needs to be reimagined by now, which for those of you, that 6-point framework takes us through leadership, governance, workforce capacity, medical technologies, quality of service, etc. And we need to reimagine that. And we also need to think through how are we having discussions about volume-based healthcare versus value-based healthcare, where the value-based healthcare is not just necessarily about the efficiencies of the system, but creating an environment where patients are empowered, where we take health promotion and health education seriously, where there's a breakdown in the hierarchy of professionalism and there's true multidisciplinary team working, etc. And I think then we also need to think through sustainability. How are we going to be able to sustain our health systems? And that is the end of my presentation. And I just want to share with you, I hope I've stimulated thoughts, but then we have lots of references here that you can look through as we make this presentation available. And I hope, Sonia, that was what you were wanting. Okay.
Thank you so much, Dr. Graves. I think a homegrown understanding of public health in the region is certainly itself a reparatory justice project. So I want to thank you for putting that squarely on the table. Thank you for defining public health, epidemiology, the fact that public health is interested in the population as a whole, including the marginalized, that it requires monitoring some of the things that we have not necessarily we don't have the systems in place. We have, in fact, as you said, quite fragile systems, for fragile healthcare systems and institutions, especially considering the emerging infectious diseases that, for me, the concern also is around the ways in which these NCDs are increasing in children. So when we look, 10, 20, 50 years down the line, particularly in the context of zero population growth, what are we looking at where our populations are concerned? So we not only have fragile healthcare systems and institutions, we have a fragile population. And we have to come to grips. I think this is what you're asking us to do. Come to grips.
I'm begging us.
Yes, come to grips with this reality. And that, yes, we know the statistics around NCDs and so on, but do we understand what the implications are for our population and for the systems in place, the institutions that would help us to navigate a healthy population? And this is why, my major concern in the Center for Reparation Research now is around wellness. Mm-hmm. And that wellness, in an interdisciplinary sense, is going to concern us with a number of questions. So I really want to thank you. Your presentation resonated with me at several levels, and I'm sure it is the same for all of us on this webinar. I want to ask Dr. Plummer now to present, and also just to remind our participants that you can pose your questions in the question and answer function, that we will respond to your questions after we have all our presentations. Over to you, Dr. Plummer.
All right, thank you very much. Thank you for having me. And today I want to talk about Black wellness as a decolonial reparatory imperative. And I want to what I'm going to do is just reflect on the research work that I've been involved in, and just some of the outcomes and what it is that we've done, and just the framing of wellness. Because one of our research group, we are moving towards framing wellness as a kind of imperative that we as people of African descent, and we who have been formerly enslaved, as something that we are entitled to. So I want to reflect on two different interrelated strands of research that I'm involved in. So one is a research group on wellness, and the other one is Caribbean Foods for Climate Justice Research Group. So I'm going to start with the research group on wellness, and the members include Dr. Jelani Nair, Dr. Sonia Stanley Nair, and myself. And what we've done, and we are actually doing, is that we are looking at diet, and we're looking at Rastafari Ital cuisine as a kind of decolonization of the palate. And we're also in that process conceptualizing wellness through a kind of decolonial lens that allows us to break from the past, to break from colonization, to break from enslavement, to break from those patterns of ill health that have been brought from the past to the present. Now, the second research group that I belong to, we are Caribbean Foods for Climate Justice. And we actually have a website, caribbeanfoodforclimate.com. Now, this is an interdisciplinary research group. It includes individuals from the UK, from several areas of the University of the West Indies. So we're looking at geography, myself from the Institute of Caribbean Studies, biotechnology, the Sir Arthur Lewis Institute, and we work closely with Kasikiani Ronaldo Pearman and Kasiki Pearman of the Taino indigenous group. Now, this research area, what we have done, we've actually done two research. The first one is to engage young people on foods for climate justice. So the first one was Recipes for Resilience, engaging Caribbean youth in climate action and Afro-descendant food heritage through story mapping and song. And what this research was about was connecting youth to their past, their food heritage, their food culture, and even agrarian foodways. And we did it through the use of storytelling, and we all came together to create a song. And I'll talk a little bit about that. And our second research that we're involved in right now is teaching climate justice and resilience through ancestral plant heritage in Jamaica. Now, these were funded research, and the second one is even more targeted towards using African and indigenous food heritage and reintroducing it to young people, particularly because we have found that the attitude towards older foods, towards traditional foods, in light of the rising impact of fast food and imported food, that their attitudes was rather negative. Now, some of the research output that we've had is, of course, the song Recipes for Resilience. And I'm not sure if I'm going to have any time to play that song. But we're also looking, working on an ancestral gardens cookbook. We're also doing a virtual tour. We've done a publication, and several publications are in the work, and several presentations internationally. No, the research groups are interrelated, and what they overlap in the areas of health, nutrition, but importantly, looking at the past. So there's a Sankofa element to it. Let's fix ourselves by looking backwards, right? Let's not throw away who we were, even as we want sustainable futures. There is the acknowledgement of historical legacies and inequalities that have come in to affect our health outcomes today. And whereas my two presenters are working very directly in the field of health and public health, we're tackling the issue through an interdisciplinary lens, through cultural studies, anthropology, history, geography, biotechnology, and other disciplines. So we are roughly centered in the past, looking at the future. So what were some of the things that came up? What were the, in terms of just the research? Well, one of the things that we have to acknowledge is just the historical legacies of the plantation and its impact on Black health. No, we're talking about diet and nutrition and healing. Previously, during the period of enslavement and even afterwards, it was about, on the slave ship, it was about fattening us. No, and I'm not talking about fattening us in the terms of fattening, but feeding us enough to get us across the Atlantic. When we got to the Atlantic and we got onto the plantation, was feeding us with a high carbohydrate diet to get us to work in the fields. It was not about our wellness. Healthcare was a kind of patch and go sense of thing. So it was not about the human being. It was literally about ensuring that we were okay enough to work. So the other issue now is culture of wellness and care. What do I mean by that? If we're coming from a system that was about patching us up to work, then the attitude towards wellness and care will definitely demonstrate some of that callousness, right? And we're only just moving out of that. There's this idea that let's fix the diet, the glucose is high. No, you're going to go ahead and fix it. You have hypertension, let's fix it, patch it, go along, get to work. So we're fixing you up to function, and functioning is fine, but it is a part of that colonial thinking that our health belongs to the economy, right? You heard it, our health belongs to the economy. But really and truly, decolonial thinking is our health belongs to our community, to ourselves. Then, of course, there's taking care of our mental health. And I am heartened to see some of the developments in this area, but we do have a ways to go. Vacation, walks, all those things are very important, even as we move away from these old ways of seeing health. No, one of the reasons I deliberately put vacation here is that there is a culture for us where vacations are used to work. So we have summer term, we get breaks, but we use it. We go overseas. Quite a number of people go overseas and they work. They're always finding work. We go overseas and we shop. There's movement. But there's no time to sit down and to be still in this space anymore. No, there's also moving, the fact that we have to move away from colonial constructs of Black bodies in movement. Black bodies were meant to work, to service, of course, the mother country. But what about Black bodies when it moved across the landscape? When Black bodies moved along over the landscape during the colonial period, this was called vagrancy. And if you're trying to catch us, it was called marronage. Hiking and rambling were never words associated with people of African descent. So we're trying to change that as well. We're trying to change the perception of the body as worth more than just work. Caring for the body as something that is lovely, beautiful. And if we don't do that, there are things like, I use dis-ease and disease because we're uneasy. But there's also the diseases that come with that uneasiness. And my presenters have already spoken about the rise, and even our moderator, the rise of non-communicable diseases. But I am also adding here the breakdown in interpersonal relationships as a sign of that unwellness, stress as a sign of unwellness, leading to some of the previously mentioned issues. Now, climate change and its unequal impact on formerly colonized spaces and places is one of the things that we have to look out for. We do not, because of colonialism, have the resources, right, to adequately protect ourselves. The industrial practices, the warming of the planet, due in part to some of the resources that were taken from us, from our bodies, and sent overseas, is something that is a part of this discussion about reparations. The dominance and the power and all that industrialization is coming back to affect us. Food sovereignty and this issue of import dependency, right, is something that comes even from that colonial and plantation legacy. The young people right now are demonstrating a preference for fast food, for imported foods. There's a lot of food heritage, a lot of food culture. And the fact is that some of the foods that we were growing before are quite are able to withstand the changing climate. So if it is that we don't look backwards to fix our diet now, we're going to be in problems. Now, our research then embraces African and indigenous food heritage and agrarian practices, look at the best practices in order to look at the future. Now, let's frame Black wellness, and I'm taking here from Barry Chevans, who saw the self as divided into mind, body, soul, spirit, and I put in bracket, of course, shadow. So to heal the self involves an integration of all of these, and I've kind of put forward a framework that we can think about. So let's look at the mind, the fact that it has to be healed. There's a lot of anger, damage, pressure that comes from the past that we need to confront. There's mental health. We have to think about involving meditation, integrating nature, stillness, silences, and how do we release some of these pent up issues and stress and dis-ease. Now, there's also the body. And my colleagues have spoken quite a bit on the body. And there's diet, whether you're thinking about ITIL, whether you're talking about slow food or eating mindfully, food as medicine. Because if you eat right, you don't have to be on all of those imported medicines. Moving away from processed foods and fast food, being proactive. And we're even talking about food vendors. I remember the other day asking for tea without sugar. And the person said to me who was serving me, not even a little sugar, how you can drink the tea without sugar. So when you're sometimes interacting with food vendors, there is a lack of knowledge even around nutrition. And you're viewed with strangeness when you make certain requests. Exercise, green spaces, and I put deliberately safe spaces, because if the space outside is not safe, we're not going to go out there. So safe spaces and green spaces in a way go hand in hand. And there's also urban design. If you want to ride, if you're do cycling across Jamaica, it's very difficult. So we have to think about urban planning and all of this. And then there's a spirit, the soul. You're thinking of fulfillment, religion, spirituality. And of course, I go back to meditation and some of the things that we do with the mind. So when we're thinking about Black wellness, we're framing wellness as an integrative practice, as multi-sectoral. We have to define wellness, on our own terms, right? It must be our terms. And I like Barry Chevans' framing. The reality is, however, we do have some challenges. We have a healthcare system that is underfunded. We have a declining dollar, and the fact that we have to be working extremely hard. We live in a world where the economy is given primacy over everything else, where people are constantly working. We're dealing with poverty, we're dealing with lack of intergenerational wealth. So even as I framed the Black wellness, I'm also acknowledging that some of these things are difficult to achieve when you don't have, in some respects, the wealth or the time, or even the space to achieve them. There's also crime, there's reliance on importation, and of course, you need land. And much of our land these days is going towards construction and development. So there are fewer and fewer green spaces, even going into mangrove spaces. But there's hope. Despite the challenges, things are changing. There are local and international hiking groups for Black people. I mean, and for me, it's a big deal, because we're going from getting fined and whipped and beaten for vagrants, for words like vagrancy, right? For words like truancy. There are alternate restaurants and diners. Social media is spreading information far and wide. There's lobbying taking place. Research like mine that I'm involved in. We're sharing it, and that's why I've started there. We're sharing it, we're putting it out there. And we're hoping, because some of for Caribbean Foods for Climate Justice, we do work with 4-H teachers and educators. So we're hoping that there will be change on the horizon. And that is, I've made my 15 minutes, and that is the end of my presentation.
Thank you so much, Dr. Plummer. I think that these presentations have dovetailed nicely into each other. Your presentation has specifically continued the call from Dr. Graves' presentation with a context of decolonizing the palate or diets from a sort of decolonial lens. eating mindfully, thinking through vacations, meditation, a sort of wellness thinking as our way out of the looming crisis positioned by the previous presentations regarding the epidemiological context that we now find ourselves in, where diabetes, cancers such as prostate cancer and breast cancer and hypertension are the norm. So I want to now open up to questions. Remember, you can post your questions in the chat. I see there are 3 so far. We have some comments and questions. Damien is asking us to list the chronic and other diseases which impacted us to up to present throughout the generations. And we have named some of the contexts in which we have been predisposed to some challenges. So the salted diet, I don't know if any of you would want to respond to that question.
Yeah, sure. I started to think about your question, Damien, so thanks very much. And I was feverishly typing out a response, but realized I'm not sure how to post it. But I think it would be useful, I figured out how. I think it would be useful to think about the conditions in which people lived and worked at a particular time. And I can post it at least to the other panelists, and then work from there. So for example, in the earlier phases, you can think through the infectious diseases that would have affected the moms in the postnatal period. So endometritis, then you can think through all your childhood infectious diseases that are now vaccine preventable. So mumps, measles, rubella, whooping cough, etc. But then you have to think about the diseases that would have impacted persons by virtue of where they worked. So field labor, etc. So whether that's leptospirosis, dengue fever, yellow fever, including yellow fever in the Panama Canal and those kinds of things in post. And then certainly we still have to think about the water wash diseases that still raise their heads sometimes when our health systems are broken and our general infrastructure. So anything from scabies to schistosomiasis, we still have lots of islands where persons may do river bathing, etc. And then you can transition then to those things, as my previous colleague would have spoken about, things that are affecting us because of our lifestyle and also because of the degeneration that is occurring within our bodies by virtue of the advanced aging that we are now achieving sometimes. So we're living longer, but not necessarily healthier. But there's a theory that living longer is false, and that's going to reverse quite quickly if we don't get our health system under control. So then you can start thinking about your cancer, your hypertension, your diabetes. So that's how I would approach it, Damien, as opposed to a list of sorts. I hope that helped. I think you're muted, Dr. Naya.
Yes, I'm speaking and I was muted. My apologies there. Thank you, Dr. Graves. I see Damien had a follow-up with recommendations, read the reparatory justice measures required in the health sector, infrastructure, the human resources, the funding. I think we have covered quite a bit of that. But we have Anthony Grant, who was posted quite substantially here. His primary research interest being focused on how intraracial xenophobia manifests in the United States between African American, West Indian, or Caribbean and African people. Another research interest of his being focused on social behavior related to COVID-19 and the long-term impact COVID-19 will have on marginalized people. And I know that you mentioned public health earlier, Dr. Graves, being something that is of interest to the entire population, including those who are marginalized. So he's saying that he read your 2021 article and really wanted to thank you for sharing today definitions of public health and what public health could look like with reparations, considering the CARICOM COVID-19 response within the WHO model you and your colleagues laid out in the article. So that's really a comment.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anthony, and thank you, Damien. I see we have another, yes, Damien saying thank you. I don't know if at this point you each would want to provide any sort of closing statements, or if there are any questions from our attendees online, please do post your questions in the chat or your comments. We will take them as we proceed, but I'm now going to ask each of our presenters, considering the materials we have heard, we have shared, the discussion we have had, would you have any closing remarks or closing statements?
All right, I think I'll start. I just wanted to respond first to the question that I think it was, let me see, Damien had asked, and it was about diet. And the reality is that even though we are forward thinking, we can't escape our past. A lot of the foods that we love were foods that were never meant to enrich our bodies or nurture our bodies or our systems. So we like a lot of salted foods. When I order soup from some places, for example, I can't get soup everywhere because there's an overwhelming salt in there. And when you think about how much water you retain in your body because of that salt, and you think of our taste for sweetness and all these things and these legacies that we have made do, it's no wonder that we are fighting a struggle here. There are people that even if you inform them and you tell them, so one of the things that we do in our research group is that we also show how you can use a small piece of land or property, or even Dr. Sylvia Mitchell and Dr. Thera Edwards with their geography and agrarian backgrounds show that you can plant a few herbs, some foods in a small plot of land, and people will not do that. So there's need for change. But I think it can start at the societal level by acknowledging that we are a composite of self, mind, body, soul, spirit, shadow, and healing can only be done within that integrative praxis. That we have to look at the past, throw away what is not useful, and embrace that which is useful, and move forward. So that's how I would close, to see wellness and to put Black wellness as an imperative, a decolonial imperative, because we cannot use even medical research itself can be biased in favor of people who are, the test subjects who are white. White medical medicines may not be working for us. So we have to start looking within and at ourselves and at how we survived and take what is good from it. That is, for me, is the decolonial approach to wellness.
Absolutely. And I think you have echoed, just in different words, the very point that was made by Dr. Graves. And perhaps we can go in reverse order and just take her own closing comments now.
So I would say, thinking back to that picture of the baobab tree.
There is no question that the severe population bottle permanent. Sorry, Dr. Greaves, you go ahead. You go ahead, Dr. Greaves.
Yes, I think there's just a small delay on your side, Prof. Aiken. So we'll come to you after Dr. Graves.
I was saying that the picture of the baobab tree, I think for me is very profound, in that we want a strong, robust tree. And therefore we need to understand all of the factors that are influencing our roots. And to do that, we are going to need a multidisciplinary approach. And I was smiling just now when my colleague spoke about the medicines that don't work for us. And I know sometimes you would think, oh, that's the fact that contemporary globalization does not work for us in all of it. In its truest sense, in the pharmaceutical industry is not something that we need to be debating anymore. A lot of what we do in terms of the African Caribbean Consortium is to help to create the genetic repositories that help us to accelerate precision medicine for African ancestry populations. And I think arguments for significant investment in science, imputational science as well, that will help us to figure out which kinds of medicines and which medicines that are all around us, that have historical knowledge, that are hidden in the plants that our grandparents would pound up, or the castor oil that my mother put on my chest from the leaf when I was pregnant. There's knowledge that has to be valued, that has to be gained. And I really would love for UWI to reimagine public health.
Thank you, Dr. Graves. It is about looking internally and to face ourselves as African people. and all of what that entails in terms of knowledge systems. Professor Aiken?
Yes, thank you, Dr. Standenauer. So there's no question that the transatlantic trade in organs created a severe population bottleneck, which led to genetic changes, irreversible changes through what we call epigenetic changes in our DNA that would have been passed on through generations, and the subsequent inbreeding of slaves would have consolidated this. And I'm sure we're seeing the phenomena we're seeing today is as partly a result of that genetic shift in our population from West Africa to the New World. Things, phenomena such as a high mortality rate from prostate cancer, I am sure that we can trace its origin back to the transatlantic Africans, and certainly other phenomena that we see nowadays that creates a severe public health challenge. As more research is done, we're going to discover more things related to the transatlantic trade. Progress being made. I'm happy to know that the University of the West Indies has created its own prostate cancer cell line from persons of African ancestry to be able to test drugs in the future and so on, that Caucasian cell lines would be inappropriate to test on. So we are making some progress, but there's a lot to be done. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I really am so overwhelmed by the kind of discussion that we have had here, and I hope the gravity of what we have shared has not been lost on all of our participants present. I really want to thank you all for attending. I want to thank our presenters for sharing their work, for responding to the call to share their work, and that we will, coming in the next few weeks, announce other webinars. I want to have you join us for others in the series of webinars that we will do focused on the CARICOM 10-point plan. Indeed, we have a lineup of conversations coming focused on cultural institutions and repatriation, on things like climate justice, knowledge reclamation, and of course, the whole question of cultural reparation. So stay tuned. We at the Center for Reparation Research, you can find us on Instagram, you can find us on Twitter, X, formerly Twitter, or handle CRR_UWI. Find us. We want you also to come and visit us. Stay tuned for the ways in which we will announce these upcoming events and to share with you more in the context of the reparatory justice movement in the Caribbean. I want to thank you all for coming and to say to you, continue the conversations in your community, in your bedrooms, in your offices, in your corner of the world, so that every citizen, especially of the Caribbean, will become aware of why reparatory justice, why repair is critical at this time. Thank you so much all. See you next time.